Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on the vital and frankly harrowing new anthology, Imprisoned Souls, Poems of Uyghur Prisoners in China. This collection, it documents the voices of 25 Uyghur poets, intellectuals who have been systematically targeted and silenced by the Chinese government since 2017. And when we consider a poet like Cornisa Gulhan getting 17 and a half years in prison simply for the words she wrote, we are forced to ask a central question.
Right. And that question is, should the primary importance of this poetry be framed as a direct act of political resistance and defiance against oppression? Or is it better understood as a testament to, an enduring Uyghur cultural continuity and its traditional emotional expression?
And I lean very strongly toward the first few. I see these poems as a necessary poetics of political resistance. It just feels almost impossible to look at this material and not see defiance as its central functioning purpose.
And while I certainly don't deny the element of resistance in these horrifying circumstances, I believe the core power of this collection lies in its deep manifestation of cultural and emotional continuity. It demonstrates the profound survival of the Uyghur spirit, using these traditional forms that existed long, long before the current crisis, and sort of independent of any explicit political intent.
But you see, the state has effectively redefined the act of writing as a political crime. The source material says it explicitly, that for these poets, their only crime was to think, to write, and to belong. So when imagination itself is forbidden, the simple act of putting pen to paper shifts fundamentally from a cultural practice to a defiant declaration. The state's reaction proves its political function. I mean, Cornisa Gulhan's 17-and-a-half-year sentence for separatism based on her poetry, that proves the regime interprets this material as inherently seditious. The poetry functions as a cry against violence and oppression that refuses to allow Uyghur voices to be effaced. And the act of publishing this work internationally is, it's essential literary activism. You just have to look at the Savitsky Museum success story, where a book's attention saved an entire collection of banned art. This collection, I think, holds a very similar potential to mobilize crucial international attention.
That's an interesting point about mobilization, but I would argue that to view this poetry solely through the lens of political resistance, you risk overlooking its profound cultural significance, which is precisely what the repression is targeting. I mean, if the state's goal is to arrest the soul and sever language from its speakers, then criminalizing traditional expression is the ultimate objective.
Right.
Poems themselves, they're described as not polemical and not strident. They contain, and this is a quote, an awful lot of love poetry and draw heavily on the classical ghazal form, which is, traditionally a short lyric love poem. The fact that the state is terrified of traditional love poetry, well, that tells you everything you need to know. The expression of suffering and longing for a lost beloved is noted as a very traditional thing in Uyghur poetry. So the core power for me rests in this cultural survival, not just in explicit dissent. The state is the one making the traditional culture the crime.
I see why you emphasize that aesthetic tradition, but let me offer a different perspective on that. Under these circumstances, cultural resilience is defiance. The refusal to surrender language, or imagination, or love. As it's noted in the material, that is functionally a political stance against a system designed to achieve cultural erasure. And we even have specific proof of active defiance happening inside the camps. The poem, Nameless. It was reportedly smuggled out of a prison. Now, that is not merely passive cultural continuity. That is a specific, deliberate act of resistance, bypassing the censorship of their captors, driven by an incarcerated individual's struggle for survival and freedom.
I'm just not convinced that tactical defiance fully captures the depth of this work. The reader is moved because the poetry's resilience is rooted in the maintenance of the human spirit, of memory under this immense duress. That feeling, that nostalgia for the homeland, it transcends tactical politics. What makes this such a tragedy is precisely that this deep emotional and traditional cultural expression is what was retroactively criminalized and then used as evidence of guilt. The state forces us into this political reading by making culture illegal, but the poetry itself is still driven by deeper, pre-existing cultural currents. And to really understand that act of criminalization, we have to look at who the state is primarily targeting. The scope of their project gives us some clarity here. The crackdown clearly defines the state's project as one to remove a class of Uyghur leading voices of intellectuals. This includes editors, translators, and crucial academic figures like Dr. Rahila Dawood, who is the leading scholar of Uyghur folklore, and Professor Toshbalat Tiep, the former university president.
Yeah, this sophisticated repression is aimed at the leadership that sustains the culture. The repression is precise because it turns culture into evidence of guilt, targeting the class, even if the content they wrote, often publishing in, officially sanctioned local newspapers, was previously seen as completely innocuous. While I agree the targeting of cultural leadership is strategically precise, the poetry provides the active mechanism for challenging the state's effort to create this layer of silencing. You mentioned the aesthetic form, but that form has become the vector for political communication. Take the poem Yeneram. It was set to music in exile after being smuggled out. The subsequent banning of that song in Xinjiang demonstrates that the state perceives the circulation of these aesthetic expressions as a direct, actionable threat that flows back and impacts the homeland. These poems aren't just cultural artifacts. They become highly potent political documents that the regime fears once they enter international discourse. And this leads directly to the critical point about the efficacy of publishing. The translation and publication of this anthology is absolutely essential literary activism that challenges impunity. It works against that layer of silencing by making the poet's plight visible. As the publisher noted, attention is achieved through the books too. And that attention is a political resource. This is an ethical act of solidarity, and by listening, we directly challenge the state's attempt to erase identity.
That is a compelling argument, but I think we have to view the impact of publishing soberly. The material itself acknowledges the enormous practical challenges. The publisher noted the difficulty of selling translated books in the UK, often having to fight for every single sale and relying heavily on continuous promotion. Moreover, the media concentration on other global conflicts, the Middle East, Ukraine, has caused the critical exposure of Uyghur human rights abuses to cease. While the act of publication is an ethical imperative, its measurable impact on changing policy or securing releases faces enormous obstacles, not least because of Western governments' fear of offending powerful China.
But those global political limitations don't diminish the fundamental political job the text is doing, keeping memory alive against a state designed to wipe it out. Even if policy change is slow, the ethical act of solidarity has a political function of preserving identity and providing hope. The act of bringing these voices to the English-speaking world is in itself a defiant declaration against systematic cultural erasure. These poems are aesthetically rich, yes, but their political significance today is derived from their function as the last standing testament to a suppressed people.
That the material demands the word bear witness. However, I still believe the enduring power of this collection rests in its affirmation of Uyghur cultural continuity through its traditional emotional expression. The fact that traditional cultural forms, poetry rooted in love and longing, and sometimes even satire, become grounds for a 17-year prison sentence, that just underscores the truly brutal nature of a repression that seeks to extinguish the spirit and the identity itself. This tragedy illuminates the true scope of the atrocity.
Approaching this material through both the lens of political resistance and cultural continuity really does deepen our understanding of the incredibly high stakes involved in cultural survival under state repression.
Indeed. And in either case, the voices of those silenced must be heeded. What remains undeniable is that by simply listening, we are participating in their ongoing act of cultural survival.